Hello, Northstar here with a little Northstar Talks Politics, specifically socialist self-criticism. Now, some of you may have heard self-crits before, or little bits of it. Sometimes these aren't the most honest. People are looking back at the mistakes of socialist movements, and when we say self-criticism, we mean the criticism of the group rather than the individual. Although there can be criticisms made of modern socialists for not being active enough or being too passive or being quite vigorous in their opposition to the current system in words, but or even in actions, but not doing anything to increase the number of people who think likewise, because without the numbers, any of this is useless. But this is more about history. I had some thoughts, and looking back at the history of the Soviet Union in particular, because that's the thing that still lives large in the public conscience. You still see people making up shit or pointing out its flaws or pointing out its strains. There's endless debate. Um, when Trump sends people to concentration camps, people don't compare it to Nazi death camps. They say, "Ooh, off to the gulags." um, when right wingers talk about dictatorships, they try and bring up Stalin. There's, it's very much a piece of history that has not been resolved, forgotten. Uh, Now, I don't have time to defeat every right wing lie, and there are many of them from the 100 million dead black book of communism bullshit, by the way. A very, very, very quick bit on that. People who said that fabricated the numbers, and they included Nazi soldiers who died in an unprovoked war of aggression on the Soviet Union. They included those soldiers and the children they would have had if they didn't go off and die murdering millions of people. Because, yeah, it wasn't just soldiers who ended up dead. Nazis murdered 4.5 million Soviet civilians. They're shooting them, they're starving them to death, they're burning their villages, people dying of exposure. 4.5 million civilians dead. Um, and, you know, the people who are doing this unprovoked genocidal campaign are somehow considered victims of communism. But those people said it's enough said about that shit. Um, but there are criticisms to be made of the direction the Soviets took, uh, and socialists have taken in the past in general. First of all, I would point out Marxist Leninists, and I am a Marxist, but not a Marxist Leninist, will claim that the only way socialists could ever take power is revolution, nothing else has ever happened. That's not true. A great example of that is Chile, where socialists were elected. And then the United States supported, in fact, started planning before the socialists even took power, a coup that put Augusto Pinochet in power. But socialists did technically take power for a short time. Venezuela, similar socialists have taken power, though they have been blocked through political means from actually instituting any of the reforms they want. So Venezuela is not a socialist economy, it is a socialist ruling party. There's a difference. Because there are checks and balances on power, and there isn't enough popular support for socialism. They're not able to do many of the reforms they want. They nationalized the oil industry, but then been able to nationalize a lot of other industries, for instance. But at the same time, the socialists retain enough control that the capitalists haven't been able to just go and take back power and reverse the changes they did manage to push through. So it's a country in a state of limbo. But the point is, socialists won elections before. That's not true. They haven't. It's not true that capitalists would never allow socialists to win elections. It's true they will often not allow it. They will rig elections. They will cheat. They, of course, will use the apparatus of the state to suppress socialism and to interfere in supposedly a marketplace of ideas. They'll rig that marketplace of ideas. This is nowhere more clear than when you see U.S. government funding uh, ultimately supported by the taxpayers and by deficits that will have to be paid back by future taxpayers. Uh, that money being used to support through various institutes, through various security state apparatuses from FBI, CIA, NSA, wherever, uh, National Endowment for Democracy, they go about um, spreading anti-socialist propaganda with taxpayer money. So influence the marketplace ideas, not allowing socialism a fair fight, and then proceed to claim socialists lost the marketplace of ideas battle. No, it didn't. You rigged the game. You forced people at the point of a gun essentially to give them their money, because that's taxes are always backed by the threat of force. Libertarians at least do have that point correct, that the state will come after you if you don't pay your taxes and arrest you or kill you if you violently resist being arrested. You get the idea. Um, so people sweat blood and tears because money represents human effort. It's taken from them and then used to propagandize the population, both within the United States and around the world, against socialism. That's fucked up. And it gets even more fucked up when there's billionaires who buy the government and then they get kickbacks and then they fund right wing think tanks that are even more open in their anti socialism and ultimately are funded by corporate welfare. So it's not true that the game is always fair or that it's always possible for socialists to win elections. But whether socialists take power via electoral or revolutionary means, they have a need to defend their worker state when they take it. Uh, if the Chilean socialists had been armed and organized into militias in greater numbers, perhaps they would have defeated Allende's. I mean, not Allende's. Allende was the socialist elected. Sorry, Pinochet's coup against Allende. Perhaps they would have been able to defeat the Chilean armed forces, which weren't enormous. They were large for such a small country, but Chile is a mountainous country, and organized armed resistance might have been able to defeat Pinochet if it was organized and determined enough. It was not. Excessive pacifism can be a problem. Heck, it can be a problem in the capitalist world. You can see with Germany today, they haven't learned their lesson from history apparently at all. Um, Germany is now starting to rearm. Yeah, people beg, please don't give the Germans guns. Please don't give the Germans guns. We gave the Germans guns. And they're pointed at Russia. They're not pointed at the United States, which is putting people in concentration camps, that has committed more genocides than any other nation on earth since the end of World War II. Since the end of the Nazis in Japan, the U.S. has been responsible for more mass murders. They're puppet regimes, but the Indonesian genocide, the Bangladeshi genocide, the Guatemalan genocide, these all rest squarely the blame for these on the shoulders of the U.S. government and the State Department. Um, Diplomatic cover was provided for these genocides. Funding was provided to these regimes. The United States went so far as to almost cause a nuclear war with the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union tried to use its fleet to block arms shipments, ammo shipments into Bangladesh, where Bangladeshi genocide was being carried out by the Pakistani army. So, pacifism, dumb. And of course, that's one of the things I did want to point out. Socialists can get trapped into pacifism. They can also get trapped into caution, though. And caution can sometimes be the opposite of pacifism. Stalin is a great example of this. Stalin did not want to upset the West. He was worried that if the capitalist powers got too angry with the Soviet Union too soon, they would unite against him and invade, and the Soviet Union would be doomed. So he did things like with the Spanish Civil War, he supported the Republican government instead of independent socialists. He he was not too aggressive in supporting socialist uprisings and subversive movements in Eastern Europe. Uh, Generally speaking, Stalin tried to avoid provoking the West and initially hoped for a mutual defense agreement with them. The foreign minister, uh, Maxim Litvinov, uh, he he was the foreign minister before Molotov of Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany fame. Linov was the first foreign minister, and in the early days when Stalin was really trying to avoid provoking the West, Linov tried to seek a mutual defense agreement with France, Czechoslovakia, sound familiar, and the UK. UK shut that down almost immediately. France, Czechoslovakia, and oh yeah, agreement for troops to be able to move through Romania to reach Czechoslovakia if Czechoslovakia were threatened. Um, Romania tried to shut down any movement of troops. Poland also didn't allow it when Romania said no. Czechoslovakia was pressured by the British into not agreeing to this defensive pact, which would have otherwise led to the German takeover of Czechoslovakia being an automatic declaration of war on the Soviet Union. And Czechs would not have gone down without a fight in that situation either. They actually surrendered without fighting the Nazis, and that would not have been the case under British pressure, mind you. British foreign diplomats pressured the Czechs not to fight because it would start World War II, they were worried, which World War II happened anyways. Um, this is Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler. But Stalin tried to avoid provoking the West, didn't work. He tried to reach an understanding with the Nazis later after the West wouldn't sign defensive agreements, did not work. He was so concerned with ways the Soviet Union could fail, he didn't look to see that they would fail in the long run by not succeeding wildly enough. This goes to what the Trotskyites have to say about the Soviets. Now, I'm not a Trotskyite. I'm not a Marxist Leninist, but the Trotskyites do have some valid criticisms, and it's worth looking at them for a second. Uh, One step back, though, while I'm Stalin, more directly on the topic of Stalin, his excessive caution also led to obsession with rooting out subversive elements. This is what led to the Great Purge, which was a witch hunt, which killed 700,000 people in the Soviet Union. There are grossly exaggerated death tolls that say worse, but it doesn't matter. It gave the West the excuse to perpetrate many more genocides in later decades. This is the Indonesian genocide, where over 1 million leftists and their families were murdered in Indonesia under Suharto. They all have very similar names. There are a series of actually elected presidents who are left wing and far right dictators, and their names sound very similar. So I'm not going to try and pronounce. I'm not going to. I probably am getting the names mixed up, but the far right dictator who is a CIA puppet, US-supported, his regime was only able to hold power through massive foreign aid the US government provided him, and not the elected social democrat who was in charge of Indonesia before him, who he replaced via a coup. So elected left-wing guy, US tries to undermine his regime. Right-winger takes power, coup, US provides tons of foreign aid to stabilize that far right regime. Then that far right regime does a genocide, and the U.S. Turns a blind eye to it, provides diplomat cover, and even provides weapons and ammunition for the mass murder of leftists, and for increasing the military so there won't be an armed rebellion while this genocide is going on. This is very much the U.S. perpetrating a genocide. And there are more direct ones, like the Guatemalan genocide, where U.S. aid actually provided financial support for the police officers and military death squads, their families. So would like care for their families where they're off killing people, Maya natives in Guatemala. You can find similar things with Nicaragua with the Contras. U.S. aid was again involved there. So U.S. government has a long history of perpetrating genocides, but it was able to get away with this partly because pointing fingers at the Great Purge, which was a result of Stalin's caution. It was a result of Stalin's obsession with hunting out subversive elements because it might destroy the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, he destroyed some of his own people's faith in the socialist project. He destroyed some of the world's faith in the socialist project. And his obsession with building socialism in one country, he failed to see that the Soviet Union could not possibly survive if it ended up besieged by the West as it was in the Cold War. The Trotskyists had this point, and this is what I wanted to get to here, that if the Soviet Union was besieged, even if it had expanded its influence somewhat, as it did in Eastern Europe, if it was besieged and outnumbered by the West, it would lose. It did not matter if socialism was a better system, if even if they achieved higher rates of growth, they were behind the West when they were formed, and there was no way they could possibly make such a distance up on their own resources if they were besieged by the West. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The Soviet Union actually had a higher long-term GDP growth rate if you look at 5-year intervals, which is the Soviet Union did 5-year plans, so 5 years is an appropriate time frame. You can also do 10-year intervals. And until the crisis that resulted from the end of the Bretton Woods global banking system with Nixon, so from 1945 to 1971-72, the Soviet Union had the highest long-term GDP growth rate in the world after France, which actually had higher. These were the 30 glorious years, I think is the French nickname for this time period where they were number one. Then they hit stagnation. The Bretton Woods system, you can tell it wasn't just socialism is uniquely vulnerable because the French were not socialists. They were social democrats, capitalists. And their system collapsed with the end of Bretton Woods and their GDP growth rate plummeted. The Soviet one did as well. Japan ended up becoming number one after this. But so many countries were hurt so badly that the Soviets actually still were well ahead of most countries in long-term GDP growth rate, even after the end of Bretton Woods, because it fucked up a lot of countries. And even the ones that did relatively well under it still did often worse than before its end, with only a few exceptions. So I think Japan was one of those exceptions because it did benefit Asia, and this was part of Nixon's attempt to ally the Chinese also, because then Bretton Woods enabled Kissinger to go to China. It enabled the whole system of industrialization of China with U.S. in foreign direct investment, which is how China became now the world's largest economy. It is a bigger economy than the United States. That is a proven fact. I mean, not the wealthiest per person. Their population is much larger, but in absolute size, China is the world's largest economy, and per person, the U.S. isn't number one either. There's little like oil emirates that have higher GDP per capita in the U.S. So, and little micronations in Europe and such. So you can't look at GDP per capita, and you cannot look at absolute GDP and either one find the U.S. at the top. It's number 2 in total GDP, and it's like number 14 in GDP per capita, 12. So, yeah, U.S. not the wealthiest country in the world, just the most militarily powerful and culturally has a long period of dominance, and it was number one during the Cold War. China only surpassed the U.S. very recently, like in the last 10 years. Anyways, so Trotsky had a point. If the Soviets were outnumbered, if they were surrounded, and if they were taking a fairly hardcore approach to socialism, as they did, not at all like, say, China, which had a very different idea of how to reach socialism, agrarian socialism, Mao's theories. I have to mention agrarian socialism because China was a much more rural country, and Marxist theories postulated that socialist revolutions would occur in industrialized nations, which China was not when the communists took over. So Mao created a new set of theories, which sometimes called socialism with Chinese characteristics, but more broadly, agrarian socialism was the idea, were the ideas of Mao, an idea that farmers could be the basis of a revolution, and they were in China. And so there was a much greater emphasis on abolishing land rents, on giving the land that was owned by these giant landlords, worked by peasants, just giving the land to the peasants who own the land communally. And even though China is a major industrial economy today, and initially when it became socialist, it was not industrialized after it became socialist, and hasn't really socialized a lot of the new industrial sector that's arisen since, whereas the agricultural sector is still very much socialist. Most agricultural land in China is owned by workers' cooperatives or state agricultural cooperatives, or the state directly it is very much state controlled, as well as electricity, healthcare, uh, what they call the commanding heights of the economy are controlled by the state, which is controlled by the Communist Party, which is an attempt at socialism. Of course, is the Marxist-Leninist variant, which is much more centralized than, say, market socialism, or the Democratic Socialist approach tends to at least be a little less centralized, even if it's still not market socialism. Um, in many cases, some Democratic Socialists are market socialists, some are not. At one time, I was market socialist, and I've come to see there's probably need for more central planning than market socialism allows. French had this idea, I think it was called Dirige's May, which is somewhere between market socialism and full state planning, and that's probably where the sweet middle ground lies between the two. But regardless of what is pursued here, I could be misremembering that term. Let's Dirige's May. Hold on. Nope, I had it right. Dirige's May, or dirigism, from French diriger, to direct, is an economic doctrine in which the state plays a strong directive role, contrary to merely regulatory and non-interventionist role of a market economy. While it's generally framed in terms of capitalism, there is major types: capitalism, socialism, communism, which is to say it's compatible with Marxist-Leninism. It's compatible with other types of Marxist socialism or non-Marxist socialism, because socialism encompasses both Marxism and non-Marxist socialism. Yeah, Dirige's May. So something like that might be more of a appropriate solution in most cases. Full state control is difficult without it. We're starting to get to where it's actually feasible with AIs being able to really enhance the efficiency, but it's difficult to do really, really well otherwise. Of course, certain sectors need to be state controlled, like infrastructure, power. You definitely can't have the fossil fuel industries running laissez-faire or even partly market, because you see what happens. They'll pursue their own profits. Even if it's workers' cooperatives, a worker cooperative oil company is still going to try and drill more oil when we need to stop drilling more oil, because climate change is going to kill billions of people if this keeps up. Anyways, there are too many. The vast majority of socialists these days are Marxist-Leninists, and there are too many of them that hold strictly to Stalin's interpretation of Marxist-Leninism and of Marxism, and they ignore any of the critiques of Trotsky, of Bukharin, of Rykov, of any of the opponents of Stalin, who all had useful critiques. But I think the most important one is this idea: socialism obviously needs to get established wherever it gets established, whether it's by election, revolution. But once things are stabilized, well, it has to spread. It has to spread around the globe like wildfire, because otherwise the capitalist powers will surround, subvert, and destroy it, as happened in the Cold War. It didn't matter the Soviet economic growth rate was high. It didn't matter that people had free healthcare, free education, a free minimum standard of housing. They had to pay for more if they wanted more, and subsidized food, although not free. Food was highly subsidized, to the point of people paid about a tenth what it was really worth. Now, this was partly a response to the Great Famine of the 30s, the policy of subsidizing food. It reached its heights under Khrushchev, if I'm not mistaken, but the idea started right after the Great Famine, because the Soviets didn't ever want to have people starving to death again, contrary to the right-wing opposition. Oh, they're just evil and they want to starve people to death for no reason. It's funny how people will apply that standard to socialist countries, but I talked to a certain family members, and she's like, countries don't just kill people for no reason. And she was talking about, I was explaining to her the Jeju massacre, and how the South Korean government killed 100,000 people for the Korean War. and how they were a brutal dictatorship. And she was like, they don't just kill people. No, it's like, no, that was a reign of terror to intimidate the population into compliance with the dictatorship, and particularly to intimidate leftists in South Korea. This government was not popularly supported. It was a puppet regime set up by the United States after World War II in areas that Japan had controlled that had not been liberated by the Soviets. The areas liberated by the Soviets ended up in North Korea, within the Korean Peninsula we're talking about. And yeah, but people, it's funny how people will say stuff like that about capitalist countries, but you start talking about socialism and they think that socialist regimes just murder people for no freaking reason. No, they don't. Either there's a reason or they didn't really do it. Um, the Great Famine obviously happened. The Holodomor was real, but that does not mean that it was intentional or planned on a central level. Now, there were individual racists who, secret police officers, local bureaucrats who did requisition food from communities and caused them to starve to death when, it was famine conditions. Some of those people hung for what they did, were shot, hung, or sent to the gulags where they died of frostbite sometimes, or sometimes they served out their sentences and lived, but they were killed or sent to prison for what they did, many of them. There were investigations. So it was not a matter of the central government planning genocide. It was a matter of racism, and that makes perfect sense when you consider that Tsarist Russia had been around, like, what, less than 15 years ago, and the Tsarists were extremely racist. A country doesn't just stop being racist in 15 years. That, I mean, like, if the US went socialist tomorrow, its legacy of racism would not disappear in 15 years. That would not happen. And you could see, horrible tragedies occurring if the US, let's say climate change led to severe droughts and the US couldn't meet its food needs, and for some reason, let's say it was sanctioned by the rest of the world and could not import food, because that's actually what happened to the Soviet Union with the Great Famine. If that were to happen, you can bet there would be a racist element in African Americans being deprived of food at greater rates. It wouldn't be because of socialism, it would be because racism doesn't disappear that quickly. Um, but Stalin, he was something of an idiot in the end. I mean, he had some great points on some things, like if you antagonize the West relentlessly, they will come and they will crush you. But on a lot of things, he was incredibly wrong. And because things became so divided, because Trotsky and the Trotskyites were purged, as removed from the Communist Party, and many times cases sent to prison. The ones who were committing terrorist acts were killed, and many people were suspected of being Trotskyites who weren't. But that's another story. Because this happened, now their ideas were incorporated into the mainstream Marxist-Leninist theory that survived after the Great Purge. And then we have Marxist-Leninists saying they have this blindness. Socialism can't survive in just one country. It may have to start there, but it can't. Even in the United States, if it's somehow a Marxist revolution, and that seems almost impossible with the state of the world, it's going fascist. Trump is putting people in concentration camps in the Sikot mega prison. He's deporting more and more and more people. He's aiming for like 300,000 people a year, and he's asking El Salvador to build 5 more prisons that can each hold, what is it, I think 40,000 people. So he's obviously not just sending people just to El Salvador is the plan, but it's 200,000 people. He's planning is 200,000, maybe 250,000 people. He's planning to send El Salvador, and another 50, 100,000 probably to other countries. He's also trying to make deals for other countries to take people he's going to port and put them in mega prisons as well. So, yeah, U.S. probably not going to, but if somehow it did happen, the U.S. wouldn't be able to survive isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, the U.S., even under its capitalist system, can survive isolated from the rest of the world. And even under, in fact, less so, because a lot of the U.S. doesn't make things anymore. It imports manufactured goods from places like China. And without the financialization of the global economy, without basically the U.S. controlling these companies on paper, even though U.S. workers aren't doing any of the work of making these things, without lending, without U.S. control in the World Bank, things like this, and without the U.S. dollar being the global currency, the U.S. wouldn't be able to get these manufactured goods. It wouldn't be able to borrow money for its trade deficits. We wouldn't have any of the things we need in the United States. This is probably part of why Trump's doing his old tariffs thing. But his direction is more from the fascist direction. Somewhere out of Hitler pursued autarky because he didn't want Germany to be dependent on imports of manufactured goods when he was going to go to war with the rest of the world, because that would have left Germany in a position where they couldn't win such a war. I suspect Trump is trying to build economic self-sufficiency because he's planning on a more confrontational, aggressive approach to the world. Within capitalist frame of logic, it's more logical than it might seem. The United States is a waning power, and if it doesn't go and conquer some countries and expand its borders, it will fail, and Trump probably knows that, and so he would rather conquer other countries than, give up on capitalism. But socialists would much rather we give up on capitalism than go conquering other countries. But you can see that there's a certain insidious logic to what he's doing. But while it may be hopeless in the United States, let's say Sweden or Germany, I'd like to go to Sweden. Get the hell out of this country because it's going fascist and American. And let's say I make Sweden, which is one of the countries that's most friendly to people with disabilities. I'm disabled on COVID. It sucks. That's why I do YouTube. Let's say I go there, and let's say I mentioned there because it's a country that's got a lot of, because it's where I might end up, and there's a lot of social support. Let's say the socialists there, they get their act together, they get organized, and they have a socialist revolution or an election that leads to reformation of the Constitution to enshrine socialism. Let's say this happens. Sweden goes socialist. Can they survive on their own? No. They better spread that revolution to surrounding countries. France, Denmark, Norway, Finland, because if they don't, they're going to freaking fall. And it can't just be a regional thing. In the end, it has to be a worldwide socialist revolution, which is a scary thing to the capitalists, and that's why they have always attacked socialists, because I think they see it more than the socialists themselves that this may be necessary. Of course, this leads, there's another reason for that, and that's that many Trotskyites give up on socialism after a while and become capitalists, become neoliberals. And they carry that perspective with them of like the crusade mentality. They both realize that socialists will need to do a worldwide socialist revolution and now feel scared by that because they're no longer socialists, they're capitalists and become part of the ruling class often. In fact, these are usually sellouts who sell out their values for opportunities of power. Or, they see things as this crusade for democracy, or quote, democracy around the world, even though democracy in a lot of capitalist countries is a sham. The U.S. is an oligarchy. That was proven by a study a number of years back. The same standard was, by the way, applied to Germany, which also met the definition for oligarchy, even though its system nominally looks more egalitarian in the way it's structured on paper. There's the same complete lack of correlation between what most people want and the laws they're passed versus what the ruling elites, the very, very rich, want, and the way the laws go. It's a little more correlated, but there's still very weak correlation with any group's opinions other than that of the richest 10% and what happens. So Germany is an oligarchy. The United States is an oligarchy. Oligarchy is the norm in the capitalist world, and it's just dressed up as democracy. So it's kind of absurd when you have neoliberals fighting a quote crusade for democracy, and suggests a certain lack of honesty, which I guess makes sense given that many Trotskyites are very good liars and that some of their perspectives filter into neoliberalism because there's this former Trotsky to neoliberal pipeline for whatever reason. That may have something to do with Trotsky himself being a conniving piece of shit, but he did have a point, though. Socialism's got to spread or it will fail. And socialism will reemerge someday, hopefully. If it doesn't, humanity is screwed, and there's not going to be a future because climate change will kill us off, and we're getting to an era of death, of killer drones, of death robots, of AIs controlling everything. It will be impossible for people to have even the flimsy excuse for democracy we have today, and it will just be 1984 dystopia if we stick with capitalism. So hopefully there is socialism somewhere, and hopefully socialists have learned this lesson. They have to spread the revolution, whether via peaceful or violent means, because a lot of countries it's just not going to be possible to have peaceful transitions. Let's give an example. A country it's very obvious: Saudi freaking Arabia, absolute monarchy. You want to bring socialism there, you're going to have to do it through supporting insurgencies or invading the country. It's not going to be possible to bring socialism to Saudi Arabia through peaceful means. Uh, so you may be able to support socialist parties in some air quote democracies with enough mass protests, but sometimes these countries would just go fascist to avoid losing power, and then you'll have to invade. Um, so even there, socialist state better be well armed and it better be very, very, very gutsy. And some of these risks could lead to its destruction, but if these risks aren't taken, destruction is assured. The Soviets made that mistake, I think, and they could play it safe. And eventually, they paid the price for it. The Soviet people lost faith in the socialist project. The Soviet Union collapsed itself with Gorbachev's reforms, moves towards capitalism, the infamous Pizza Hut in Moscow, all these things, symbolic and more practical. Socialism collapsed because people stopped believing it. And that's what will happen if you're besieged and you're a minority ideology of the world. If you're outnumbered 2-1 by the capitalists. So, yeah, this has been a bit of self-criticism of past projects. And I know it's meandering. I know it's not perfect. But I do think if I can just get people thinking a little bit and thinking about the mistakes of the past and in a way that allows, because a lot of these Marxist Leninist self-crits, certain things are off the table, like admitting Trotsky was right about anything, or Stalin was wrong about anything, or that Mao is wrong about something, because a lot of them tend towards being like Stalinist, Maoist, somewhere in between. And I'm not a Marxist Leninist, so maybe it's easier for me to look in from the outside. Vanguard Party is useful for socialists to take power via revolution, but there's great danger that it will not be disbanded after the revolution. It's a very dangerous institution to keep around after socialists have set up a worker state. You need opposition parties. You need multiple competing socialist parties, and they have to be all viable. North Korea has multiple competing socialist parties, but only one of them is large enough to be viable, and others have like 3% of the vote each. So there's a bunch of them, but they're too small and fragmented, and they're intentionally kept that way so they don't pose a serious threat to the ruling party, which gets like 65% of the vote every election. Yeah, it's not 99% fate. No, they have I think, election on maybe their supreme leader, where it might be more like that, because these things are yes no votes, and if it's no, then it just goes to another conference to select another leader, and they'll just get presented with the same guy again afterwards. So it's kind of pointless if you don't have opposition parties. Democratic centralism has some issues, and that's one of them. Of course, it works a little better with some local politicians. The Soviet Union yes/no votes sometimes did result in the no votes, and then they would select a new local representative at the mass meetings, which were competitive, essentially nomination processes, but you could still always select people who were endorsed by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So, and it was the Communist Party. It wasn't, one of 6 parties that would each put up their own candidates, but are all socialist. You can ban capitalist parties, but you can't ban opposition parties. You need other socialist parties. Anyways, I hope you folks enjoyed the talk. Do well. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. May you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Till next time, this Northstar. Adieu.